Hello and welcome to the third video in my 10-part series on how organizations burn out their employees. I'm Dr. Geri Puleo, the President and CEO of Change Management Solutions. Now in these videos, I'm going to discuss how organizations unwittingly burn out their employees. And today we're talking about an overemphasis on the return on investment. So when companies tend to overemphasize the return on investment, their mantra seems to be, it's all about the money. Now, money is important in business. It's one of the key indicators of whether or not a company is successful. However, by overemphasizing the return on investment or ROI, organizations can burn out their employees, and burned out employees are disengaged and not as productive as employees who aren't burned out. Now, in my research on burnout during organizational change, I specifically asked my participants to tell me the ways in which their organizational practices led to their burnout. Now, one of the things you have to keep in mind is I did not list an overemphasis on ROI as one of the key factors in creating their burnout. However, 28.6% overall specifically identified this overemphasis on ROI as a key factor that contributed to their burnout. Now, not surprisingly, this was a little bit more prevalent in nonprofit organizations, as well as with those employees who were the targets of their organizational change, about 33% overall. Now, this number was slightly less for change leaders at about 25%, but that could be because change leaders' effectiveness during the change initiative was measured by their ability to reduce expenses in order to increase profits. However, when you brought together an overemphasis on the return on investment as well as cutbacks that organizations implemented in order to reduce expenses and bolster their bottom line, this contributed to burnout in my participants at a whopping rate of 71.4%. So let's talk about this connection between burnout and an overemphasis on ROI. This is the beginning stage of my BDOC model, or the Burnout During Organizational Change model, and I went into a little bit more detail about these preliminary stages in the first video in this series. But to recap, most employees are initially hopeful in their ability to meet performance objectives in the organization. However, based on organizational policies and procedures, this can lead them to become increasingly frustrated, angry, apathetic, and finally to burnout. So let's talk about how organizational actions that overemphasize the return on investment triggers this demise into burnout. Well, first of all, this is when organizations overtly state that the emphasis is on the bottom line or the money. The problem is their actions then reflect their inability to remember that people must implement whatever actions or processes need to be taken in order to achieve their goals. So in other words, they emphasize money, but they seem to totally forget about what these actions are doing to their people. When this happens, workers become frustrated, and over time they can become really, really angry. In addition, an overemphasis on ROI is shown when companies make radical cutbacks in the wages or salaries that they're paying their employees, the benefits they're offering, and all the different financial and human resources that it is enabling employees to use in order to achieve their goals. So when a company is always cutting back or trying to be lean and mean, this can be to the real detriment of feelings of security, safety, and engagement in employees. And when these cutbacks in wages occurs, employees can become really, really angry because not only is it affecting how they perceive their workplace and how they're doing their job, but a cutback in salary or benefits can really impact their lives at home. Now, what all this leads to is a spoken or unspoken belief that cost and expense are the only indicators of success. Nothing else seems to matter. And this reflects the old adage that profit is king. Even though organizational leaders might believe that, it's when that belief is internalized by employee that it leads to something even worse. Because employees' actions will then be determined by what they're being paid, by their salary or wages. In other words, if the company can say, well, let's take a look at the cost of this thing in order to determine whether or not there's a good ROI on us spending that money, employees look at it a little bit differently. What is the cost of my time in order to do what you're asking me to do? In other words, is the time that you want me to expend in order to complete these tasks equal to the money that you are paying me? And when this happens and employees become burned out, you often hear workers say, I don't care how much you're paying me, it's just not worth it. So if you as an employer can overemphasize the return on investment, employees will also overemphasize the return on the investment of their time in relation to what it is that you're paying them or providing to them in the way of benefits. So this all loops back into feelings of presenteeism, which is basically you're just there and doing the bare minimum, or even going into total disengagement, which is when the employee is no longer engaged, is no longer proactive, and really no longer cares about the company. And when you have a workforce that no longer cares, this results in not only disgruntled workers, but because these workers are performing the tasks of the organization and they're not doing it very well, this leads to dissatisfied customers. And we all know that dissatisfied customers will take their business elsewhere. So the challenge now is how to identify what the real cost is. And you need to look at what the real costs are, both the tangible and the intangible, in order to ensure that your employees will be engaged in achieving organizational goals and that you will achieve those goals in a way that is profitable. So first, we need to measure the quantitative goals. Now, this is usually the quote easy part of performance metrics, but you have to identify the real costs of any actions that you're going to be taking. In other words, you need to dig deeper and look at the tail of those cost reductions. Let me give you an example. In these cost reductions, if you are trying to decrease costs by decreasing payroll through a workforce reduction, well, that might look good initially on paper, but studies have shown that companies that downsize within a few years are right back to the same numbers of employees that they were prior to that downsizing. But the problem is that their reputation as an employer may seriously be compromised and employee morale tends to go down. So that's a really long tail of something that on paper looks good. Cut the payroll, make more money. What you need to recognize is that not spending money may cost you more in the long run. For example, if you've got outdated technology, but oh, we can't afford to upgrade our tech, what you're going to have is inefficiency throughout the organization. And inefficiency lowers productivity. Also, if not providing adequate resources to employees so that they can do their jobs, is it results in lower productivity and and increased burnout. So in other words, if you don't spend the money that's necessary to do the work of the organization, in the long run, it's going to cost you a lot more, both financially and in terms of your reputation as an employer. The other thing that you need to recognize is that time is not always money. One of the big things in customer service organizations is this trend towards saying you can only spend X number of minutes resolving a client problem. Well, as anybody who's ever worked in customer service knows, some problems require more time to satisfy the customer. But the employee who adequately satisfies the customer's needs but took too much time in order to do it will become penalized, even though the end result, which is a satisfied customer who stays with your company, that's more important than penalizing an employee because he took a little bit too much time in order to do it. What you need to remember is not all the performance metrics for your organization are going to appear on your financial statements. Financial statements are actually historical documents. They're not really that predictive. Now, it's true that you can see certain trends in the numbers that give an indication where you're going and where you might need to take remedial action. But financial statements can't enable you to see all of those intangible aspects of your business. You can't see the levels of employee burnout or disengagement. So the key takeaway here is to remember that what gets measured gets done. So really take a look at the costs of your financial performance metrics. In other words, remember that there's more to a successful business than just the money. The money that you generate as a company follows the quality of the performance of your employees. So that leads us to the flip side of these performance metrics. And you need to also measure not just the quantifiable financial aspects of your business, but also those qualitative, intangible aspects. Now, these qualitative measurements are usually not found on financial documents, and they're kind of difficult to develop metrics. So one of the ways that you can develop these metrics is to start focusing on the behaviors, because employee behaviors arise from their attitudes, beliefs, and their values. These are those intangible soft skills that can differentiate you as a company from your competition. And it's these intangible soft skills that determine the overall quality of performance in your workforce. Couple of things to look at in terms of identifying these behaviors. Technologically, look into your HRIS or your Human Resource Information System for signs of burnout via metrics related to tardiness, absenteeism, and turnover. And on a more human level, have your managers encourage, listen to, and then incorporate their employees' ideas on efficiencies. Now, you can do this formally through employee surveys, but if you're going to survey employees, make sure that you provide them feedback on how you're following up on their suggestions. Because if they fill out a survey in good faith and then nothing happens, they're probably going to become disengaged because they believe the company just did it because they were supposed to, but really didn't care about what their employees said. Probably the best ways to get ideas on efficiency from your employees is to informally ask for their suggestions. Because what I've discovered in working with companies is that the employees who are doing the work are the ones who know where the company is really wasting the money. So don't leave them out of the loop in ways to measure the qualitative aspects of your company. So the key takeaway here, it's important to remember that employees are your only non-duplicatable competitive advantage. If financial success follows performance, it's the employees who determine the quality of that performance. And engaged employees are absolutely irreplaceable and non-duplicatable and can give you a competitive advantage that your competitors can never meet. So perhaps John Hayes, the CEO of American Express, said it best when he reminded us that we tend to overvalue the things we can measure and undervalue the things we cannot. Companies are not their financial documents. Companies are comprised of the living heartbeat and humanism of its workforce. Don't overemphasize the financial return on the investment, but instead focus on balancing your performance metrics on the tangible and the intangible.